Today we're going to talk about food acquisition systems. Humans, the human animal is an animal like other animals, and of course we have to get food. We normally think of agriculture as the way that we do get food, but the truth is, if you look at it from a broader perspective, there's many different ways that we have gotten food in the past and that we still get food today. Now, classic ideas on this are usually divided into three segments. You usually think of cultures that are hunters and gatherers, then cultures that are agriculturalists, and then we have the modern agricultural system. There is an alternative point of view, and that alternative point of view is that food acquisition systems are all about ecosystem management. Ecosystem management, which we have been doing for a very long time. The standard story, not necessarily the correct story, but the standard story is that we had basically agriculture began maybe 10,000 years ago and been in two different places really. Up here you can see that on the map, there's the center over there in China where you had rice about 10,000 years ago was domesticated, and then in the Middle East, in the Middle East where you had wheat that was domesticated, again about the same time, and then over in the Americas you had corn that was domesticated. And there was a series of other crops that were domesticated more or less at the same time. This caused the Russian plant geographer Vavilov to suggest that there were centers of plant domestication. These were long known as the Vavilov centers. Now, the first thing to note here is that it's kind of an oversimplification when you look at all the various domestications that happened, many of which seem to be independent of one another. So the idea of domesticating plants actually was something that was fairly diverse. But it's still useful kind of to think of those three Vavilov areas. We have the rice over in China, and then the wheat in the Middle East, and the maize or corn in the Americas. But we want to go back much further than that, and we can gain some insights from a particular culture that still exists today that we believe at least until recent past, used to practice as main traditional ways of acquiring food. These are the Guarani. It's a culture that lives in the Amazon, in the upper Amazon, in an area that today is known as Ecuador. They are classified normally as hunters and gatherers. They hunt bushmeat in the forest, gather tubers, fruits, and berries, and things like that, as a classical hunter and gatherer society does. Here is a Guarani gentleman demonstrating the poison arrow darts that they use to do their hunting. They hunt with blowguns and poison arrow darts. And here's a hunter returning from his hunt, and you can see he's already got a monkey there. One of the things that these people hunt mainly is monkeys. That's kind of drives their hunting culture, as a matter of fact, which is interesting. That becomes a piece of the culture that's important for my story here, okay? Because monkeys are very smart, as everybody knows, and so when you have people hunting monkeys, the monkeys tend to run away from where the hunting is. So what the Guarani do, actually, a family or a family group, they move to an area, they sort of clear out some of the brush in the understory, they clear out the understory a little bit, and they make a little settlement like this one here. That little settlement is actually temporary, and it's going to be there. It's going to represent the hunting ground for the next who knows how long, months, maybe as much as a year, maybe longer. So that's not really important, but a relatively short period of time. The idea is as they begin hunting, they go out in that direction today, that direction tomorrow, that direction the next day. And they find the monkeys and they kill them when they can. They eat, that's the main food source that they have. But the monkeys, obviously, the monkeys learn that there's hunting parties around there, and gradually the monkeys sort of get out of the area. Now, a lot of them get killed by the Guarani. That's almost certainly true. But they also, because they're very smart creatures, they learn that it's pretty dangerous in that area, so they sort of leave. Well, when the monkeys leave, since the monkeys are the favorite food of the Guarani, why the Guarani leave also? And they leave their clearing and they move away from their clearing. Now, before they leave the clearing, they plant this particular trees that yield this particular fruit. This is called the pehibahi palm. It's a peach palm, is what you could call that in English, and it's absolutely delicious. There's a market. I took this slide in Costa Rica. There's a market in Costa Rica for pehibahi palms. Costa Ricans really love pehibais. Well, I do too, actually. They're really very delicious. But most places, other places in South America, for example, use the pehibahi palm as pig food or just animal food. It's not really highly regarded outside of Costa Rica, a little bit in Nicaragua also, and as I say, by me. So what the Guarani do is in their clearing, they'll plant a tree. This is what the tree looks like. And in many ways, it looks like a regular tree in the forest. This was a mature one. It's bearing fruit right now, just like trees in the forest bear fruit. Now, the point here is that if the Guarani are there for just a year or so in one area, this takes maybe 3 or 4 years to mature to the point where it begins bearing fruit. And then it will bear fruit, who knows, for another 20 or 30 years. So why do they plant that in their little settlement when they know that they're not going to be there to harvest the fruit? Well, it turns out that apparently they have a mental map or a historical map, a map through their through mama and papa and grandma and granddad and great grandma, etc. They know where the trees are. The trees are now part of the forest. Okay, the trees seem like they're just a regular part of the forest, and when it's harvest time, that is, there's a certain time of the year that the pehibais, that the palm fruits come into fruit, like most trees in the tropics. The Guarani know when that time of year is, and they go on extensive extensive treks through the forest to find those old trees that they had planted, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, maybe great-great-grandfather had planted one of them. Okay? So is this actually agriculture? I mean, the truth is they plant a crop and they harvest the crop. It's just that they treat it as if it were one of those fruits that they just gather from the forest. So are they hunters and gatherers, or are they agriculturalists? Obviously, in a sense, they're both. What they are is they're ecosystems managers, as are all human beings that get their food somehow or another. Even those so-called hunters and gatherers who just go out into the wilderness, so to speak, or that's the impression that we sort of have, to just gather nuts and berries and things like that, almost always, when you look very closely, you find that they do intervene in the ecosystem. They do things to the ecosystem that make it produce for them or enhance the production that they really want to have enhanced. So we're all ecosystems managers. The question is, how do we do it? A particularly interesting system of ecosystem management is in this area. This slide is from in the Extremadura in Spain, at the part of Spain that sort of borders on Portugal. And there's a huge area that looks more or less like this. Those are all oak trees. There's a couple of different species of oak trees, and there's sort of grassland in between the oak trees. Now, what happens in this area is it's commonly populated by these guys. These are wild boars, and wild boars have been there for a long time, obviously. And one of the popular pastimes, I guess not so much anymore, but it used to be a popular pastime, is what they used to call big poking. People used to ride on horses with big spears and try to kill the wild boars for eating. So this was regarded as an interesting sport in times not so far distant. Here's a picture that I took just a couple of years ago from inside of that forested area. And as you see now, we don't have wild boars there, but we do have little piggies. And this is a fairly common system now. It's extensive areas in southwestern Spain and Portugal. The system is called the Dehesa system, D-E-H-E-S-A, Dehesa system. And what it is, it's a system of, I guess you call it wildlife management, but they have pigs pigs is the most important part. They have sheep, they have goats, they have cattle, and they also within the system, they grow some grains. They have little patches that they open up that they grow grains. It's a fairly complicated system. And the point is, it's very, very, very old. As far as we know, it has existed forever, okay? It probably existed at the time that the Phoenicians came to the area. The oak trees, this is an example of one of the species of oak trees. This is called the cork oak. You harvest the bark of the cork oak, like this gentleman is doing, which is one of the reasons that Portugal, by the way, is exceedingly famous for supplying the world with the bulk of the world with most of the demand for corks. That comes from the cork oak tree, which exists in this Dehesa system. Now, one key feature of the Dehesa system is that the oaks, of course, produce acorns. The pigs eat the acorns, and it turns out that when pigs eat acorn, their flesh becomes very, very delicious. And as a matter of fact, hams that are made from Dehesa pigs are very delicious, from my point of view at least, and I do eat pig meat. But sometimes it's a little bit insane. There was, as of last year, I'm speaking in 2020 right now, as of last year, there was for sale on the internet, you could find for sale one ham that costs over $1,000. So it's an incredibly valuable commodity that's produced in this system. Now, the reason the cork oaks are cork oak, of course, most people would agree that the reason that bark grows as thick as it does is that it's an evolutionary adaptation to fire. And fire is one of the most important things that maintains systems like this in the wild. So here you see the Dehesa system burning, and you see the results of the burning. Of course, the oak trees aren't burnt. The oak trees don't suffer at all, but partially because of that thick bark. But even if it wasn't such a thick bark, the fires that spread through the grasslands there are very cool fires. They don't really damage oak trees. And so that's part of the way oak savannas are maintained. Oak savannas are maintained through periodic fires, and periodic fires are the management tool that people probably used since the time of the Phoenicians, maybe even earlier, who knows? But we don't know how long this system has actually existed, just that we just know that it's exceedingly old. As I mentioned in my previous lecture, it's the case that our line of evolution, that is the genus Homo, which includes Homo erectus, has been around for a long time, and there is evidence to indicate that it was Homo erectus who originally learned how to manage fire. This cartoon version of it here, I don't know if this is the way it happened or not, but I think we can safely presume, or we can at least speculate, that if they could control fire, they almost certainly used fire to their advantage. And I would say that they probably used fire in the same way that the fire in the classic Dehesa system was used in order to control sort of the underlying vegetation that would come up and would harm the grasses that were there for the various livestock that was being produced. It's safe to presume, I think, that we as a line of evolution have been using fire in our systems of ecosystem management for perhaps 1 million years, but at least several thousand years, at least 10,000 years, let's say. Which brings me to Australia. Here we have sort of an iconic picture of two Australian hunters, and this is here to remind me to tell you that we have often thought of Australia as a place where, one of the only places in the world, large places in the world, where agriculture was never invented. Turns out that's probably not true, okay? And again, if we take the perspective of thinking of agriculture as just an extreme form of environmental management, it probably doesn't matter all that much anyway. But the thing is, the Australians had a very, very sophisticated way of managing their ecosystem. This is what much of the ecosystem that the native Australians live in looks like. It's very deserty, it's very dry. Some people would think it's a hard existence, but the native people have a variety of food stuff that they eat. This is this is a major source of protein. These are wickyworms. It's an insect larvae, of course, that has a lot of protein in it. And here are some other fruits that they eat. they have a very highly varied diet that they gain, and presumably just from hunting and gathering, right? Well, yes, it's hunting and gathering, but it's sort of hunting and gathering after having established places to hunt and gather. Here's just two arbitrary examples of native Australians that have set fire and are watching over the fire and are looking at the consequences of that fire. Here's a beautiful case where fire had been used very extensively by native Australians to manage their habitat. And they managed that habitat such that there were certain organisms, there are certain mammals actually, that lived in the area that were important sources of food for the native Australians. And when the British came to Australia, why the British thought that this was absolutely wrong, they had the Smokey the Bear, stop forest fires attitude, and they refused to acknowledge that maybe the native Australians had a point, and so they basically stopped the fires from happening. It's not been documented there. There were two different species of marsupial type of mammal that used to be utilized by the Native Americans that actually went extinct because of habitat loss. The habitat loss was habitats that emerged from the relatively complex fire regime management system that the native Australians actually had. So fire as a tool in ecosystem management, in Australia it was very, very evident the way it happened, but it's evident from all over the world. If it were the case that in the case of the Homo erectus, or in the case of current day people, we still use fire. Fire is a management tool for managing ecosystems. The problem is when fire gets out of control, when people use it like any tool, when you use it inappropriately, well, you can damage the ecosystem as opposed to manage the ecosystem. This part of the point, the notion that Australians never had agriculture, well, that probably isn't true at all. Now, we don't know about their agriculture largely because the British had a fairly strong negative impact on the entire native civilizations that existed in Australia at the time that they came there, and so much was destroyed. So here, for example, you have two examples here of a crop that was literally produced by the Australian people. At least the evidence from early chroniclers suggests that this crop was actually produced as an agricultural product. It's called the yam daisy. And it seems to be the case that probably most of what was agriculture, if it was agriculture, most of what was agriculture was taken over by this kind of agriculture. Of course, there were no sheep in Australia before the British got there, but the British, whenever they got any place in their empire, of course, the thing that they tried to do was make it look as much like England as possible. That seemed like the only way to be a civilized country was to make it look like England. But early chroniclers wrote things that make us really suspicious of the conclusion that there was no agriculture in Australia. For example, here from Chief Aboriginal Protector of the Port Phillip District, Georges Augustus Robinson, and he said, as he observed, native women were spread out over the plain as far as the eye could see, collecting murmong, that's the yam daisy, collecting murmong. I inspected their bags and baskets on return, and each had a load as much as she could carry. So, it would appear that indeed there was agriculture in Australia before the British got there. There's also some grain crops that seem to have been produced, but much as the other aspects of the cultures, of the many diverse cultures that existed in Australia, were modified, destroyed by the British, so was its evidence of agriculture. Another aspect of environmental management that the native Australians were engaged in were these extensive fish traps or I'm not even sure it's proper to call them fish traps, but I guess we can call them fish traps. But they did modify the various modified streams such that fish would be caught in little chambers like this and rocks. So they had a really very sophisticated system of water management also. Bringing us to the question of water management and how water is so terribly important in ecosystem management. I would be hard-pressed to find a better example where water is important than in this site right here. This is on the western coast of Peru, one of the driest deserts in the world. There's virtually no water anywhere around. Here is a Google satellite image of that general area, and this right here is the area that I'm talking about. Now, in the Google image, you can see there's a lot of green there. That's because of modern irrigation agriculture. But if you just look at the yellow parts, the yellow parts are deserts. One of the driest deserts in the entire world. If we zoom in on the Google map, this is what we see. And then if we zoom in on that map, I want to show you this particular area right here. But you can see that's well within, even today, it's basically a desert region. And this is what you see. This is what you see. This is an aerial view of the city. It's an ancient city, the city of Chanchan. The Chanchan city was one of the major metropolitan areas of the Moshi culture. And as you can see, it's a fairly extensive thing. These are all ruins, of course, and the civilization hasn't been in existence for a very, very long time. But the point is that it's a civilization that was really very sophisticated with enormous amounts of civic architecture, art, etc., etc. This paper was an analysis of the middens in one particular area in the general vicinity of the city of Chanchan and the Moshi civilization. Here are the results. And if you look down the list of things that they found in those middens, what you find is, first of all, it's a huge amount of fish. Second of all, huge amount of mollusks that come from the ocean, of course. What you don't find, you find hardly any vertebrates, and some of those vertebrates, if they're unidentified, they might just as well be fish. But you don't see any evidence of any kind of guinea pigs or llamas or any of the mammals that would be in the area. You see very little evidence of anything that might be considered agricultural. What you see is evidence of a community that was based on the sea. Evidence that their resource base was a marine resource base can be seen in all over the place if you go to Chanchan. Up here you can see the general style of the walls look basically like fish nets, right? And over here, if you look at the carvings on the wall, what are those carvings? That you might not know what they are, but if you look closely, you see those carvings are sea otters. And you see other places in Chanchan, you see evidence of fishing, mollusks, basically a marine culture. So here you had an ecosystem management system that was based on marine resources. And what's really interesting about it is sometimes there's this prejudice that we have that when you get only advanced civilization with civic architecture and that sort of thing after agriculture got established. Well, at least at the beginning of Chanchan, there was no agriculture at all. In the beginning of Chanchan, it was all based on marine resources. And when agriculture did get established, the evidence is that the main two crops in agriculture were cotton and gourds. And can you imagine why? Well, with cotton, you can spin it into threads and you can make nets out of it, and gourds can be the floats on the top of the nets, and so you can have basically a fishing industry based on agriculture. So here was a case where agriculture, to some extent, agriculture was invented for the purpose of industry, I guess, if you think of fishing industry as an industry. That is, ecosystem management did include agriculture in the sense that agricultural products were produced, but they were produced for the purpose of fishing. To the ultimate in in ecosystem management. The most intense form of ecosystem management, I would say, at least in the terrestrial sector, the most intense form is domestication. Once we began domesticating plants and animals, that did kind of change things. It didn't change the fact that we're still managing ecosystems, and we're still managing ecosystems so as to acquire food for ourselves. But now we're managing ecosystems at an incredibly intense rate. Here we have the sort of the classic idea here. This is a little bit narrow-minded, to be perfectly honest, but this is the classic idea of where much domestication actually happened. As you recall, the first map that I showed you of where domestication occurred, this is only one of the places, but this was a very important place. It's called the Fertile Crescent, extending in the green area shown on this map right over here. And that's where a major center of domestication happened. And in that area, as a matter of fact, the domestication produced a massive system of ecosystem disruption that, well, we see the evidence of we see the consequences of that yet today. In this important study, we see that we see there's evidence that much of this domestication of animals and plants sort of happened simultaneously. You did have, on the one hand, the domestication of animals was associated with the cultural habit of herding, especially migratory herding, whereas the domestication of plants was usually associated with the cultural form of farming. And we have seen all over the world, we have seen a lot of social, political, and sometimes military confrontations between herders and agriculturalists, herders being cultures that need a lot of area, and farmers being cultures, farming being in a culture that requires sort of safe space to have a farm. But in addition to the sort of contradictions or the sort of antagonisms that you might feel between herders and agriculturalists, it was also this was also a point of variability for the evolution of cultural systems associated with food acquisition systems. So it's pretty clear that in this Fertile Crescent area, and this is not terribly unusual, probably other places are much like this also, what you had was you had herding, you had farming, you had fishing. If you want to regard those as separate cultures, well, we can. I think they were sort of mixtures of cultures, and they emphasize one thing or another. But the most important thing to me is that there was interaction amongst them. They were all ecosystem managers in some way or another. And the herders and the farmers had interactions, sometimes negative, probably sometimes very positive. And the herders and the fishers had interactions, so the fishers and the farmers had interactions, no question about it. These kinds of interactions then created the conditions for cultural evolution. And so it's not just the fact of farming or herding or fishing, but it's also the fact that cultures interchange their ideas, interchange their technology, interchange their attitudes towards the ecology of their systems, towards their ecosystem management processes. And in that way, ecosystem management evolved. This happened well before domestication, well before all this activity that I've been talking about in the Fertile Crescent. But in the Fertile Crescent then, it's pretty obvious that it became very, very intense, these sort of interactions. And as we know, much of subsequent history stems from those sorts of interactions, at the base of which is the idea of ecosystem management. So in the end, what you can see is that what we have throughout history is we have a variety of moments of a variety of methods of ecosystem management. I've just touched on some of them. There are many, many others. Some of them still exist today. Some of them form the basis of what some people, some planners think that might be utilizable for developing new agro-ecosystems, especially agroecological agro-ecosystems. But we began with really planting and informal husbandry as ecosystem management when we had the peach palm trees in the forest. We talked about natural exploitation really as ecosystem management when I talked about the dehesas and the management of the dehesas with the pigs, etc. Talked quite a bit about
The fire as a tool of ecosystem management, still an important tool of ecosystem management the world over. Sometimes a very destructive tool, but not a destructive tool if used wisely, especially if used the way the traditional people have used it. Talked about ecosystem management of aquatic ecosystems, the interaction between aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. Talked about ecosystem management of water in general. Talked about the domestication as ecosystem management. Then at the end, I talked a little bit about the socio-political interactions of different kinds of ecosystem management styles and how those interactions played out. Finally, I'd like to end this lecture by talking about the idea of domination as ecosystem management. Not all cultures have the same idea that sort of the Western Judeo-Christian tradition seems to have imposed on much of the world, the idea that nature should be dominated. Many traditional societies, a lot of the ones that I talked about today, their attitude towards ecosystem management was that nature is something that we are part of, that we participate in. Like other animals, we get our nourishment and our materials to build our body from that nature, but we are part of that nature, and it is our responsibility to keep that nature there and keep that nature functioning, if for no other reason than for our descendants. That is the old adage about we basically borrow the environment from our children and our grandchildren. Today's agriculture is based on a totally different idea, that we're going to dominate things. We want to put a cornfield in Iowa and we don't want anything there except corn. And if some bad behavior comes to our farm from some insect, why, we're going to absolutely destroy that insect. We're going to bring the federal troops down on the Iowa cornfield to make sure that those insects don't come in there. We're going to use all of the armaments in our arsenal to kill them, to make sure that there's nothing there except maize, except corn. Same thing can be said about soybeans in Argentina, about rice in China. The attitude that we have about nature right now, about ecosystem management, is so different from the way traditional people used to engage in ecosystem management. And it's something that we need to reflect upon. And it's one of the ideas of agroecology, that we need to some extent get back to the idea that we're part of nature, we live in nature, whether you like it or not. You can claim that you can dominate it, but you can't really, as we're finding out with global climate change, for example. So, that's all for this lecture.